Welcome to the last but one in our mini-series looking at the heroes of the Old Testament. Today, it's Elijah. One difference between real-life heroes and the Marvel Universe type is that real heroes are actually complex human beings with foibles and failings, but they're usually remembered for one specific thing. Nelson may have been a naval hero, but he ended up armless and eyeless and messed up his personal life with his mistress, Lady Hamilton. But he was brilliant at winning naval battles. Florence Nightingale is celebrated as a heroine of nursing, but seems to have had an abrasive personality. And furthermore, one biographer suggests that her time at the Scutari Hospital had one of the highest death rates in the Crimean theatre, and that she didn't grasp the role of sanitation in disease prevention until many thousands had died, and focused instead on giving the troops warm clothing and hearty food. And that repressed guilt over her failures led her to have a nervous breakdown, which turned her into an invalid through long stretches of the rest of her life. Mother Teresa is hailed as a Latter-day Saint for her works in the slums of Kolkata, yet her methods of dealing with the poor have been open to criticism, and her own struggles with faith have been widely documented. Back to Elijah. James in the New Testament makes the point, Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. He was a human being, even as we are. The old King James Version says, he was subject to like passions as we are. He had the feelings, the strength of feelings. The New King James Version says he had a nature like ours. In other words, Elijah was basically an ordinary bloke who by persistent prayer and faith in an extraordinary God did remarkable things. The implication is that we can be like him. Hold on to that thought. Before we jump in, 3 more perspectives from the Bible on Elijah. In Jewish theology, Elijah heralds the coming of the Messiah. See, I will send my prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. That's the prophet Malachi, the last one in the Old Testament. And to this day, at the Seder, the Passover meal, a cup is set aside for Elijah, and the youngest child is dispatched to open the front door to see if this year, at last, Elijah has returned to usher in the Messiah. And Elijah is one of 3 people in the Old Testament who apparently didn't die, but was taken straight up to heaven. In Elijah's case, in a whirlwind, watched by his successor, Elijah. So that's the first thing. Elijah heralds the coming of the Messiah. Then in the New Testament, John the Baptist is identified as an Elijah figure, as the forerunner, the precursor. His father, Zechariah, is told by the angel in Luke chapter 1, and John will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And finally, in this section, Elijah represents the pinnacle of Old Testament prophecy. When Jesus took Peter, James, and John up what we now call the Mount of Transfiguration, he met and talked with Moses and Elijah, representing the law and the prophets. Jesus went up to the mountain to pray, Luke tells us. As he was praying, the appearance of his face was changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Luke explicitly says, unlike the other Gospels, that they talked about his departure. And the word is, this is another sermon, the word is exodus, a departure. A new exodus for God's people, out of sin and darkness into light and glory and the destiny that God always had prepared for us. And Elijah, as the forerunner, comes to open the way, and John the Baptist is that figure. So, 3 phases to Elijah's life and ministry: preparation, confrontation, and aftermath. Now you know where we're going, so if you need to have a snooze, you can drop off now, and I'll try and remind you when to wake up again. First of all, preparation. The background is a situation of political and religious conflict, so like many places in our world today. And Elijah, with the connivance of Obadiah, who worked in the king's palace but was loyal to the Lord, Elijah served Yahweh, Israel's true God, and was confronting King Ahab and his controlling queen Jezebel, who served the Baal, the Hebrew, or Baal, however you like to say it. The Hebrew Lord, it simply means Lord, but he's also known as the Lord of the heavens, the Canaanite god of fertility, who they believed helped crops to grow and people to become fertile and have children. So what we have here in this conflict is not just a choice between religions, but it's a moral choice. The Baal worshippers indulged in child sacrifice. We're not quite sure what that means, but it's pretty serious. And also frenzied self-mutilation, as will with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in the contest versus Elijah. We've seen a little bit of that also in the children's version. So, when Elijah announces a drought in the name of the Lord, it's a direct challenge to the king and queen and also to all the Baal worshippers. Because if there's a drought, then Baal isn't doing his job. You get the idea? Because he's supposed to provide fertility. No rain, no crops. Now Elijah the Tishbite said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." The result is that Elijah is on the run from King Ahab. And in this preparation period, he's learning to trust God, to take him at his word, to have faith in his provision, even when things seem to be going from bad to worse. So first of all, he runs and hides. And by the brook Kerith, God commands ravens to feed him with bread and meat. But eventually, due to the severity of the drought, which ironically Isaiah had prophesied, the brook dried up. And Elijah ventures further afield into a town on the coast called Zarephath. And there he meets a widow who's in a worse state than he is. And Elijah performs a miracle. But then things go from bad to worse. Let's hear what happened.
"As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Then Elijah cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, Look, your son is alive. Then the woman said to Elijah, Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth.
Elijah performs a miracle of provision through the oil and through the bread. And then the son given to the woman who was serving him dies. God performs a miracle of resuscitation. Resurrection, I don't know. But the point is that at the end of it all, there's this declaration. She knows. And more importantly, Elijah knows. Because anyone who's been in ministry know that you need the affirmation to know that God is with you, to keep reminding you that you're doing his will. Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth. Elijah has learned his lessons well, and he is now ready to confront Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Have you ever been in the situation where, despite everything, trying to do the right thing, things go from bad to worse? Despite that, keep trusting. There's a word of assurance from God in this passage. And nothing goes to waste in the economy of God. When I became a true Christian, I was brought up on the mission field, went to Sunday school, all the rest of it. It was like a Chinese puzzle. And all the things I'd learnt as a kid and the verses I'd learnt in Crusaders, which didn't really make an awful lot of sense to me, it all fell into place, when you put the last piece in and it all hangs together. And I realized that all these things suddenly made sense. Nothing goes to waste in the economy of God. And when I became a teacher, when I became a Christian, I was a teacher, and I wanted to get out of teaching. A lot of teachers know that feeling these days. God bless you for what you do, and may he give you sustenance until that time when you can lay down the mantle and pass it on to Elijah. But God bless you. But I wanted to do anything but that. And so I applied for all sorts of jobs, anything that looked remotely godly or Christian, charity this and that and the other. Didn't get a thing, probably totally unsuitable. And then suddenly the penny dropped. Jesus was a teacher. And I had to start learning to let him in to my workaday life and teaching. And things began to change. And suddenly, within a few months, I found I had a calling to ministry and was going into college to train. And that's another story. If things seem to be going from bad to worse, be assured nothing goes to waste in the economy of God. And keep sticking with it and keep praying because God has a plan. So, confrontation. We are getting there. No, go back. Confrontation, I think. On Mount Carmel, Elijah, Ahab, the prophets of Baal. After a long time in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. Despite the threat to his life, Elijah takes courage and goes to the king, who greets him with this word, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" And Elijah protests that in fact it's Ahab and his family who've been the troublemakers by persistently following the false god Baal. And he throws down the challenge to gather the 450 prophets of Baal plus the prophets of Asherah, his female counterpart, and meet with Elijah on Mount Carmel for a contest of faith to show who God really is. Elijah needed to know before this confrontation that God was really speaking through him, and all that preparation had enabled him to do it. So, as we've heard, they each make an altar, they prepare it for sacrifice, and the God who answers by fire will be revealed as the true God. And from morning till noon, the prophets of Baal pray and chant, and nothing happens. And at midday, Elisha begins to mock them. Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until the blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until at the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid any attention. Finally, at the time of the evening sacrifice, it's Elijah's turn. He built an altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench round it, or he got the blokes to do it. He got 4 large water jars and got them to fill them and pour them all over the sacrifice, and to do that 3 times so that the whole thing was absolutely sodden. And he prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burnt up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. So the prophets of Baal were taken off to be slaughtered, and Elijah stays on the mountain and prays 7 times. What persistence. He prays 7 times. And at the 7th time, his servant said, a cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. So Elijah said, go and tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and go down before the rain stops you. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rose off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord, came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. At last, the 3 long years of drought is over. But there's a storm brewing, and we don't just expect rain. This is a spiritual battle between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and Elijah, and the forces of darkness and evil. And in God's name, Elijah has triumphed over them all. So we move to the final stage of Elijah's ministry. Was Elijah hailed as a hero? No. There follow more death threats. Jezebel vows to kill him. And exhausted, he flees into the wilderness. This phase is about exhaustion, depression, and then a still small voice. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. While he went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. This is the hero of the Old Testament. He'd had enough. He sat down and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And the Lord sends an angel to minister to him with food and drink. Now, interesting fact, and hold on to this, that in the New Testament, the word angelos, from which we get angel, and in the Hebrew malak of the Old Testament, it simply translates as messenger. Now, according to the context, the translators in the Bible choose whether we're talking about a heavenly messenger or whether it's an earthly messenger. And I'm just saying this because it can be a supernatural being, as it almost certainly was in this case, or it can be a human being acting on God's prompting. Could you be an angel? You could be an angel. Hold on to that thought. Elijah has had enough. He prays to die. Then after more food and rest, at God's command, he journeys right down south to Horeb, Sinai, the mountain of God. This is just about as far as you get from Ahab, Jezebel, and their cronies of Baal worshippers in the north, right down in the south of the country. Elijah is taking time out. He's had enough. This is not just on the run. Though it's at the command of the Lord, he's out of it. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up, ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. Let's hear what happened next.
And the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?"
What are you doing here, Elijah? You know, so often in the Bible, when God speaks, it's with a question. Because he's not about commanding and directing. He's about asking us to follow him and to be obedient. What are you doing here, Elijah? The battle is up north, and you've fled for your life down to the deep south, exhausted, depressed, and lonely. And frankly, I don't blame him. And as Christians, we're stuck in a spiritual warfare. The battle is bigger than us. If we duck out, God is still working his purposes out. But when we turn back, he can still use us. Some of you may need to hear that it's okay to take time out. It's okay to take time out. God is still in control. And Elijah has an encounter with God, which has some reminiscence of Moses hidden in the cleft of the rock while God passes by. It said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." And God appears to Elijah. And Elijah has a good old moan. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me." Not the usual precursor to an encounter with God. But as the Psalms show us, God loves honesty. If that's how you're feeling, don't pretend. That way lies hypocrisy. And out of this situation, When the wind dies down, the earthquake is gone, and the storm is past, there is a gentle whisper, a still small voice, or as one translator suggests, a deafening silence. God's voice is not brash, loud, and demanding. So often, it's about us rushing ahead, taken up with the whirlwind, and we almost miss the quiet but persistent voice of God. And we have to dial back and listen. I'm reminded of that verse in Isaiah, again in troubled circumstances. Whether you turn to the right or the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. So when you're walking down the King's Highway, often you hear nothing. But when you start to veer off to the right or the left, that's when you hear a voice. But it's not loud and demanding, now hear this, God says, blah, 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 blah. It's a voice behind you. And you have to dial back and listen to it. An encounter with God, a gentle whisper. And then a recommissioning, not dissimilar to that happened with Peter on the shores of Lake Galilee in John 21. God, in his compassion, meets with Elijah, reassures him that he's not alone, that there are actually 7,000 in all Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And he recommissions him, this time with a different commission. He's to go ahead and anoint 2 new kings who will come to power in due course. And he is to anoint Elisha as his successor as prophet. The major battle of his lifetime is over. But God still has work for him to do. Those of us who are retired might like to listen to this. The major battle of his life is over. But God still has work for him to do. But it's different. It's not any longer in the same heat of the battle. Now, those of you who've dropped off, it's time to wake up again because we're going to just draw things together. There are lessons that we can learn from Elijah. And it may be that we ourselves are experiencing that period of spiritual drought. Certainly in our land, we're experiencing spiritual drought. But the lessons are fourfold. First of all, keep trusting. Keep on the move. Keep praying, even when things seem to be going from bad to worse. Keep with it. The battle is bigger than you. God has a plan, and nothing goes to waste in the economy of God. A lot of Christian living is mundane. It's about getting up, putting your clothes on, doing the washing up with a good grace. Let's not go there. A lot of Christian living is mundane, and if we can learn to trust and obey in the ordinary and the everyday, when the crucial moment of confrontation comes, then like Elisha, we will be ready. Keep trusting. Second, God is compassionate and merciful. At times we can feel exhausted and depressed like Elijah. We can feel that we've had enough and even that we want to end it all. We may not have confronted an Ahab or Jezebel or the prophets of Baal, but there are challenges enough to wear us down. Whatever the negative thoughts, try to keep moving forward. Keep trusting. Keep listening. God is still there. You are God, and I am not. Thirdly, learn to listen for God's prompting. Now, there is another sermon series, probably, listening to God, hearing his word. There are common things, but actually the way God speaks to each of us is individual. And we need to learn to listen to how God speaks to us. He speaks to some of us powerfully through music. Some of us is about studying the Bible and verses that spring out at us. Some of it is about living in relationship and finding that God's there in the middle. Some of it's going away to the quiet place. There are all sorts of different ways in which God speaks. For some people, God only seems to speak when you're on the move, in the rush, getting stuff done, and suddenly the word comes. You need to learn to listen. God's voice is not often brash and demanding. It's more usually found in the silence of a gentle whisper or the voice behind you that you nearly missed and you have to dial back to listen to. Keep trusting. God is compassionate and merciful. Learn to listen for God's prompting. And finally, God bless you, be an angel. You may not end up in a public battle with the powers of darkness, but you could be an angel supplying the needs of an exhausted prophet who's on the run from the battle. Elijah is celebrated as one of the heroes of the faith in Hebrews, but he was also very human with feelings just like ours. Be encouraged that if God can use an Elijah, he can also use you. Amen.